Tiny Gazelle begged a human for help in a burning field, and then no one expected what happened next. The air tasted like ash and panic. David Karoma wiped the soot from his eyes and scanned the horizon, where towers of orange flame clawed at the sky. The dry season had turned the East African savanna into tinder, and now a wildfire was devouring everything in its path. He had been driving back from a veterinary supply run when he saw the smoke, a black churning wall rising from the grasslands near the reserve. His instincts kicked in immediately. He pulled off the dirt road, grabbed his emergency kit, and ran toward the edge of the blaze. David was a wildlife veterinarian, 34 years old, lean and sunburned from years working in the field. He had seen droughts, poaching wounds, and disease outbreaks, but wildfires were different. They were fast, merciless, and impossible to reason with. The heat hit him like a physical force as he moved closer, the roar of the flames drowning out the world. Animals were fleeing in every direction, zebras, impalas, warthogs, all running with wild eyes and heaving sides. He knew he couldn't save them all. He could barely save himself. But then he saw her. A tiny gazelle, no more than a few weeks old, stood frozen in the middle of a scorched clearing. Her legs trembled, her coat matted with ash. She was small, fragile, barely the size of a medium dog. Around her, the grass crackled and hissed, the fire closing in from 3 sides. David's breath caught. She should have been running. Every instinct should have driven her to flee, but instead she turned her head toward him. And she didn't run away. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe and stay with us. David's heart pounded. The gazelle took a stuttering step forward, then another. Her dark eyes locked onto his, wide and glistening with terror. She bleated, a high, desperate sound that cut through the roar of the fire. It was a cry for help, raw, unmistakable. She was asking him, begging him. Jesus, David whispered. He had spent his entire career observing animal behavior, and he knew this was extraordinary. Wild animals didn't approach humans like this, not unless they were desperate, injured, or had lost all hope. This little gazelle, barely old enough to survive on her own, had made a choice. She had chosen to trust him. The flames were advancing fast. David could feel the heat scorching his skin, smell the bitter smoke thickening in his lungs. He had maybe 30 seconds before the fire swallowed the clearing entirely. His mind raced. He couldn't just pick her up. Gazelles were skittish, delicate. If she panicked and kicked, she could injure herself or worse, break free and run straight into the flames. But if he didn't act now, she would die. Okay, he said aloud, his voice rough. I've got you. He moved slowly, crouching low, his hands outstretched. The gazelle didn't bolt. She stood there, shaking, her breath coming in short, rapid bursts. David could see the whites of her eyes, the soot caked on her muzzle, the tiny cuts on her legs from thorns and burning grass. She was exhausted, terrified, and she was waiting for him. He reached her and gently slid his hands beneath her body, lifting her as carefully as he would a newborn. She was lighter than he expected, her ribs visible beneath her thin coat. She didn't struggle. Instead, she tucked her head against his chest, her whole body trembling. David held her close, turned, and ran. The fire roared behind them, a wave of heat and sound that felt like it would swallow them whole. David sprinted across the blackened earth, dodging burning branches and collapsing shrubs. His lungs screamed for air, his legs burned with effort. But he didn't stop. The little gazelle clung to him, her heartbeat hammering against his ribs like a frantic drum. He reached his truck just as a wall of flame erupted from the clearing behind them. David yanked open the door, climbed inside, and laid the gazelle gently on the passenger seat. She didn't move. She just stared at him, panting, her eyes wide and trusting. David started the engine, his hands shaking, and drove away from the inferno. For several minutes, neither of them moved. David's chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath, his shirt soaked with sweat and ash. The gazelle lay curled on the seat, her legs folded beneath her, watching him in silence. Slowly, David reached out and placed a hand on her side. She flinched, but didn't pull away. "You're safe now," he said softly. "I've got you." The little gazelle blinked once, slowly, and exhaled. David drove for another 10 minutes before pulling over at a safe distance from the fire. He needed to assess her condition. Carefully, he examined her, running his hands over her legs, checking her breathing, looking for burns or serious injuries. She had some minor cuts, singed fur on her hindquarters, and she was severely dehydrated, but miraculously, she was alive. She should have died in that clearing, but she hadn't, because she had asked for help, and he had answered. David sat back against the truck, his mind reeling. He had been a veterinarian for over a decade. He had treated hundreds of animals, seen countless moments of fear and pain. But this was different. This gazelle, this tiny, fragile creature, had looked into his eyes and made a decision. She had chosen to believe that he could save her. "Why me?" David whispered, staring at her. "Why did you come to me?" The gazelle rested her head on her front legs, her breathing finally beginning to slow. She didn't have an answer, but somehow David felt like he understood. She had been alone, abandoned in the fire, and in that moment of pure desperation, she had reached out to the only living thing that could help her, a human, a stranger. And now, whether he was ready or not, David Karoma had just become responsible for her life. He glanced back toward the fire, which was still raging in the distance, and then down at the small, soot-covered animal resting on his passenger seat. He didn't know her story yet. He didn't know where her mother was, or how she had ended up alone in that burning field. But he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to let her down. David drove back to the reserve's veterinary clinic as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the smoke-filled sky in shades of rust and copper. The little gazelle remained curled on the passenger seat, occasionally lifting her head to glance at him before settling back down. Every few minutes, David would reach over to check her breathing, to reassure himself that she was still alive. Each time his hand touched her side, he felt the rapid flutter of her heartbeat, proof that they had both survived. The clinic was a modest compound of concrete buildings surrounded by acacia trees, located on the edge of the Mkomazi Wildlife Reserve in northern Tanzania. David had been working there for 3 years, treating everything from injured elephants to poisoned lions. It was hard work, often heartbreaking, but it was the only thing he had ever wanted to do. Animals had always made more sense to him than people. They were honest, their pain was visible, their gratitude, when it came, was pure. He pulled into the clinic's dusty parking area and carefully lifted the gazelle from the seat. She weighed almost nothing in his arms. Inside, he laid her on a padded examination table beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. The reality of her condition became clearer under the bright light. She was severely malnourished, her ribs pressing against her skin, her eyes sunken with dehydration. The burns on her hindquarters were superficial, but the exhaustion and trauma were deep. "Where's your mother?" David murmured as he prepared an IV line. "Where's your herd?" Gazelles didn't abandon their young. Mothers were fiercely protective, especially with fawns this small. Something terrible must have happened. The fire could have separated them, or worse, her mother might have been killed by predators, poachers, or the blaze itself. Either way, this little one had been alone for at least a day, maybe longer. She had been starving when the fire came. That's why she couldn't run. That's why she had no choice but to trust a human. David worked methodically, cleaning her wounds, administering fluids, checking her vital signs. The gazelle lay still throughout, watching him with those same wide, trusting eyes. Occasionally, she would flinch when he touched a tender spot, but she never tried to escape. It was as if she understood on some instinctive level that he was helping her. By the time he finished, it was nearly dark outside. David sat down on a stool beside the table, suddenly aware of how exhausted he was. His clothes were filthy with ash and sweat, his throat raw from smoke inhalation, his hands trembling with adrenaline crash. But he couldn't leave her. Not yet. You need a name, he said softly. The gazelle blinked at him. David thought for a moment. In Swahili, the word for hope was tumaini, but that felt too heavy, too formal for something so small and fragile. Then he remembered a word his grandmother used to use, pendo. It meant love, affection, tenderness. Pendo, David said, testing it out. Is that okay with you? The little gazelle exhaled and closed her eyes. Pendo it is. Over the next 2 days, David barely left Pendo's side. He set up a makeshift enclosure in the clinic's recovery room, a quiet, temperature-controlled space with soft bedding and low lighting. He fed her every 3 hours with a special formula designed for orphaned ungulates, warming the bottle carefully and watching as she drank with desperate, clumsy gulps. At first, she could barely stand. Her legs wobbled, her balance was off, and she would collapse after just a few steps. But slowly, gradually, she began to strengthen. David documented everything, her weight, her feeding schedule, her behavior. It was part of his job, but it was also something more. He wanted to understand her. He needed to know what she had been through, what she had lost. Every time he looked at her, he saw that moment in the burning field, her eyes locked on his, her voice crying out for help. It haunted him in the most beautiful way. Pendo began to recognize him. When he entered the room, her ears would prick forward, and she would lift her head, bleating softly. When he sat beside her, she would inch closer, resting her muzzle against his leg. It was a simple gesture, but it broke something open in David's chest. He had spent years maintaining professional distance from the animals he treated. It was necessary, he told himself. Getting attached only made the losses harder. But Pendo was different. She had chosen him. She had placed her survival in his hands, and that created a bond he couldn't ignore. On the 3rd night, David sat on the floor of the recovery room with his back against the wall, watching Pendo sleep. She was curled up on a pile of blankets, her breathing deep and steady. The burns on her legs were healing. Her ribs were starting to fill out. She was going to survive. David's phone buzzed. It was a message from his colleague Sarah asking about the gazelle. Word had spread quickly through the reserve. Everyone wanted to know about the tiny fawn who had begged a human for help in the middle of a wildfire. It sounded like a fairy tale, David thought, but it was real. He had the scars on his hands and the soot still in his lungs to prove it. He typed back, "She's doing better, still weak, but stronger every day." Sarah responded immediately, "What are you going to do with her?" David stared at the question for a long time. He didn't have an answer. Protocol dictated that orphaned wildlife should be rehabilitated and released back into the wild as soon as possible. But Pendo was so young. Without her mother, without a herd, her chances of survival were slim. Predators would target her within days. Starvation or injury would finish what the fire had started, but keeping her wasn't a solution either. Gazelles weren't meant to live in captivity. They needed space, freedom, the open plains. Raising her by hand might save her life in the short term, but it could also doom her in the long run. She would become dependent on humans, lose her natural instincts, forget how to be wild. David looked at Pendo, sleeping peacefully in the warm glow of the recovery room. He thought about her standing in that burning field, trembling and terrified, making the impossible choice to trust him. She had fought so hard to survive. How could he let her go now, knowing what waited for her out there? But how could he keep her, knowing it would trap her in a life she was never meant to live? The question gnawed at him, heavy and relentless. David leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes. He had saved her life, but he didn't know yet if that was enough. He didn't know if saving her once meant he was responsible for saving her forever. Pendo stirred in her sleep, her legs twitching as if running through some distant dream. David opened his eyes and watched her, and in that moment he realized something that both terrified and comforted him. He wasn't going to abandon her. Whatever came next, whatever impossible choice lay ahead, he would face it with her, because she had trusted him in her darkest moment, and he wasn't going to betray that trust. Not now. Not ever. By the end of the first week, Pendo had transformed from a trembling, half-starved fawn into something resembling a normal gazelle calf. She could stand without wobbling, walk without collapsing, and her coat had regained some of its natural luster. The burns on her hindquarters were healing cleanly, and her weight was climbing steadily. David measured every gram, documented every milestone, and felt a quiet pride each time the numbers improved. But as Pendo grew stronger physically, David began to notice something else, something that troubled him deeply. She wouldn't leave his side. At first, he had attributed it to normal orphan behavior. Young animals imprinted on their caregivers. It was a survival mechanism. But this was different. Pendo didn't just prefer David's presence, she required it. When he left the room, even for a few minutes, she would panic. Her bleating would turn frantic, high-pitched and desperate, and she would throw herself against the enclosure walls. Her heart rate would spike dangerously. Once, David had stepped out to take a phone call, and when he returned 5 minutes later, Pendo had injured her leg trying to break through the gate. He sat on the floor that night, holding her while she shook, and realized the full depth of what the fire had done to her. It wasn't just physical trauma. Pendo had been utterly, catastrophically alone when she needed her mother most. And then a human had appeared, had saved her, and her young mind had locked onto him as the only safe thing in a world that had tried to kill her. "You think I'm your mother," David whispered, stroking her ears. "Don't you?" Pendo pressed closer to him, her breathing gradually slowing. David felt the weight of it settle over him like a stone. This wasn't just about rehabilitation anymore. This was about survival. Not just Pendo's, but the survival of her ability to ever be wild again. If she remained this dependent on him, releasing her would be a death sentence. She would seek out humans in the wild, approach rangers or tourists, and either be killed by a predator while distracted or become so habituated that she'd have to live in captivity forever. He needed help. Dr. Amara Osei arrived at the clinic 3 days later. She was a wildlife behaviorist from Nairobi, 52 years old, with silver-streaked hair and the calm, assessing gaze of someone who had spent decades reading the minds of animals. David had reached out to her after his 5th sleepless night, desperate for guidance. If anyone could help him understand what Pendo needed, it was Amara. She spent an hour observing Pendo through the one-way glass of the recovery room, watching the young Gazelle interact with David. She said nothing during the observation, just made notes on a tablet, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. "She's completely imprinted on you," Amara said. "You understand that, don't you?" David nodded. "I was afraid of that." "It's not your fault," Amara continued. "Given the circumstances, the trauma, the age she was when you found her, this was almost inevitable. But David, you need to understand the implications. Right now, you're not just her caregiver, you're her entire world, her mother, her herd, her safety, everything." David leaned against the wall, exhaustion pulling at his shoulders. "So what do I do? How do I fix this?" Amara was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "You can't fix it, not completely, but you can manage it. You need to gradually reduce her dependence on you while simultaneously teaching her to be a gazelle again. It's called controlled socialization. We introduce her to other animals, ideally other gazelles, so she learns what she is. We reduce your direct contact, use feeding enrichment, simulate natural behaviors. It's a long process, David. Months, maybe longer, and even then, there's no guarantee she'll ever be truly wild. But there's a chance, David asked. "There's always a chance," Amara said, "but you need to be prepared for the alternative. Some animals can't go back. They've crossed a line, formed bonds that can't be undone. If that happens with Pendo, you'll have to make a choice. Permanent captivity in a sanctuary or—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. David felt something twist in his chest. "I'm not giving up on her," I'm not asking you to, Amara said softly. I'm asking you to be realistic. This little gazelle survived something extraordinary. She reached out to you in the most desperate moment of her life, and you answered. That's beautiful, David. That's exactly why people like us do this work. But love isn't always enough. Sometimes survival requires sacrifice. And sometimes the kindest thing we can do is accept that we can't save them the way we want to. David looked through the glass at Pendo, who was lying peacefully on her blankets, her eyes half closed. She looked content, safe, alive. But Amara was right. Love wasn't enough. He couldn't keep her here forever, watching her through glass, pretending that this sterile room was the same as the wide, open plains where she was meant to run. When do we start? David asked. The first step was the hardest. Amara instructed David to spend less time in the recovery room, to begin separating himself from Pendo's daily routine. They would introduce recorded sounds of other gazelles, play videos of herds grazing, and eventually bring in another orphaned animal for companionship. But first, Pendo needed to learn that David's absence didn't mean danger. The morning he tried it for the first time, David felt like he was betraying her. He fed Pendo her breakfast as usual, stroked her ears, and whispered reassurances. Then he stood up and walked toward the door. Pendo's head snapped up immediately. She bleated once, a questioning sound. David kept walking. The bleating grew louder, more frantic. By the time he reached the door, Pendo was on her feet, stumbling toward him, crying out in that same desperate voice she had used in the burning field. David's hand froze on the door handle. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to pick her up, to tell her it was okay. But he forced himself to keep moving. He stepped through the door and closed it behind him. Pendo's cries echoed through the clinic, sharp, heartbroken, raw. David stood in the hallway, his back against the door, his eyes burning with tears he refused to let fall. Amara stood a few feet away, watching him with understanding and sorrow. "How long?" David asked, his voice cracking. 10 minutes, Amara said. "Then you can go back. Tomorrow, 15 minutes. We build slowly." David closed his eyes and listened to Pendo's cries. 10 minutes felt like 10 hours. Every second was agony. He wanted to burst back through that door, scoop her into his arms and never let go. But he didn't. Because Amara was right. Because loving Pendo meant preparing her for a life without him. Because saving her life wasn't enough. He had to save her wildness too. When the 10 minutes finally ended, David opened the door. Pendo was standing in the center of the room, trembling and crying. The moment she saw him, she ran to him, pressing her entire body against his legs. David knelt down and held her, feeling her frantic heartbeat against his chest. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." But he knew he would have to do it again tomorrow, and the day after, and every day until she learned that she could survive without him, or until they both accepted that she couldn't. That night, David sat alone in his small office, staring at the notes Amara had left him. Rehabilitation protocols, behavioral milestones, success rates for orphaned gazelles. The numbers weren't encouraging. Less than 30% of hand-raised gazelles successfully reintegrated into the wild. The rest either died shortly after release or had to be placed in permanent captivity. 30%. David thought about Pendo standing in that burning field, her eyes locked on his, trusting him with everything she had. He thought about her sleeping peacefully in the recovery room, her head resting on his lap. He thought about the impossible choice ahead, to let her go and risk losing her forever, or to keep her and watch her slowly forget what it meant to be free. For the first time since he had pulled her from the flames, David wondered if he had made a mistake. If saving her had been the right thing to do, or just the easiest. If he had condemned her to a life trapped between two worlds, too wild for captivity, too human for the plains. He didn't have an answer. All he had was the memory of her voice, crying out in the fire, and the promise he had made in that moment. He wasn't going to let her down, even if it broke his heart. The rehabilitation plan began in earnest. Amara stayed at the clinic for 2 weeks, overseeing every detail of Pendo's transition. They started with small changes, rearranging the recovery room to include more natural elements like branches, rocks, and dried grass. They played recordings of Gazelle vocalizations at feeding times, hoping to trigger some dormant instinct in Pendo's mind. They installed mirrors at ground level so she could see her own reflection and, theoretically, begin to recognize herself as a gazelle. The separation exercises continued. Each day, David would leave for longer periods, 15 minutes, then 20, then 30. Each time, Pendo would cry. Each time, David would stand in the hallway with his fists clenched and his jaw tight, forcing himself to wait. And each time he returned, Pendo would run to him like he had been gone for years. But slowly, incrementally, something began to shift. By the 3rd week, Pendo's panic episodes were shorter. She still called for David when he left, but the desperation had dulled slightly. She would cry for a few minutes, then settle down, occupying herself with the enrichment toys Amara had provided, puzzle feeders filled with fresh greens, hanging bundles of leaves, textured balls she could nudge and chase. It wasn't much, but it was progress. "She's learning," Amara said one morning, watching Pendo through the glass. "Her brain is starting to understand that your absence is temporary." "That's critical, David. That's the foundation for everything else." David nodded, but the relief he felt was tempered by exhaustion. The past few weeks had drained him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Every moment away from Pendo felt like a small betrayal. Every time he heard her cry, something inside him cracked a little more. He knew it was necessary. He knew it was for her own good. But that knowledge didn't make it any easier. "What's next?" he asked. Amara smiled. "Next, we introduce her to another animal. Her name was Nia, and she was a 4-month-old impala who had been orphaned 2 months earlier when her mother was killed by a leopard. Nia had been raised by another team at a sanctuary 50 kilometers away, and she had successfully bonded with other impalas during her rehabilitation. She was confident, curious, and most importantly, she had retained her wild instincts. Amara believed that if Pendo could bond with Nia, even partially, it would help her remember what it meant to be part of a herd. They brought Nia to the clinic on a cool morning in late August. David watched nervously as the sanctuary team unloaded the transport crate and carried it into an outdoor enclosure adjacent to Pendo's recovery room. The enclosure was large, shaded by acacia trees, with plenty of space for 2 young ungulates to interact without feeling trapped. "We'll introduce them slowly," Amara explained. "First, let them see each other through the fence. Let them get used to each other's scent, each other's sounds. If that goes well, we'll let them share space under supervision." Pendo was brought out into the enclosure first. It was the first time she had been outside in weeks, and the change was immediate. Her ears swiveled, catching sounds David couldn't hear. Her nostrils flared, processing 1,000 scents. She took tentative steps across the grass, her legs still a bit unsteady but growing stronger with each stride. For a moment, David saw a flash of what she could become: graceful, alert, wild. Then Nia appeared on the other side of the fence. Pendo froze. Her entire body went rigid. She stared at the young impala with wide, uncertain eyes. Nia, for her part, seemed completely unconcerned. She walked up to the fence, sniffed the air, and then began grazing on the grass nearby as if Pendo didn't exist. "That's good," Amara murmured. "Nia's relaxed. She's modeling calm behavior. Watch Pendo. She's processing." Pendo took a cautious step toward the fence, then another. She stretched her neck forward, trying to catch Nia's scent. Nia looked up briefly, met Pendo's gaze, and then returned to grazing. It was such a simple interaction, but David felt his chest tighten with hope. Pendo was curious. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't running back to him. Over the next hour, the 2 animals circled the fence line, gradually moving closer. Pendo would approach, retreat, approach again. Nia, unbothered, continued her routine, grazing, resting, grooming herself. Finally, Pendo stood directly at the fence, her muzzle nearly touching Nia's. They stared at each other for a long moment, and then Pendo bleated softly. Nia bleated back. David exhaled a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. By the end of the week, Pendo and Nia were sharing the enclosure full-time. The introduction had gone better than anyone expected. Pendo followed Nia everywhere, mimicking her movements, grazing when she grazed, resting when she rested. It was like watching a child learning to walk by watching an older sibling. Nia tolerated Pendo's constant presence with impressive patience, occasionally grooming her or allowing Pendo to lie close beside her during the heat of the day. And most remarkably, Pendo stopped crying for David. Not completely. She still greeted him eagerly when he entered the enclosure, still sought his touch and his voice, but the desperate, all-consuming need had diminished. She had found something else to anchor to, someone else who spoke her language. David watched them from the edge of the enclosure one afternoon, his arms resting on the fence, his heart a complicated tangle of joy and loss. This was what he had wanted. This was the goal. But seeing Pendo turn away from him, seeing her choose Nia's company over his, hurt in a way he hadn't expected. "You're grieving," Amara said quietly, coming to stand beside him. David didn't deny it. "I knew it would happen. I knew she had to let go of me, but I didn't think it would feel like this." "You saved her life," Amara said. "You gave her a second chance when she had none. But David, you also have to let her save herself now. That's the hardest part of this work. We love them. We fight for them. And then we have to step back and trust that we've given them enough." David watched as Pendo and Nia grazed side by side, their movements synchronized, peaceful. "Do you think she'll make it out there?" Amara was quiet for a moment. "I think she has a better chance now than she did 3 weeks ago. But honestly, I don't know. The wild is unforgiving, especially for young animals. But captivity isn't life, David. It's existence. And I don't think that's what you want for her." "No," David said softly, "it's not." The plan took shape over the following weeks. Amara proposed a gradual release strategy, a soft release, she called it. They would move Pendo and Nia to a larger, semi-wild enclosure within the reserve where they could interact with other gazelles and impalas through a protected barrier. They would learn herd dynamics, predator awareness, foraging skills. After several months, if they adapted well, the barriers would be opened, allowing them to choose whether to join wild herds or return to the safety of the enclosure. "It gives them agency," Amara explained. "They're not forced into the wild before they're ready, but they're not imprisoned either. It's the closest thing we have to a natural transition." David agreed to the plan. What other choice did he have? Keeping Pendo in the clinic forever was impossible. Releasing her immediately would be reckless. This middle path, this careful, uncertain journey, was the only option that honored both her survival and her freedom. The semi-wild enclosure was located in the northern section of the reserve, a sprawling area of grassland and scattered acacia groves bordered by natural rock formations. It was as close to true wilderness as they could provide, while still maintaining some level of protection. A wild herd of Thompson's gazelles frequented the area, along with zebras, giraffes, and a few resident elephants. Predators were present but monitored: lions, leopards, hyenas, all the dangers Pendo would face if she were truly free. David spent days preparing the site with the reserve staff, reinforcing certain sections of fencing, setting up observation posts, installing cameras to monitor the animals' behavior. Every detail mattered. Every decision could mean the difference between success and tragedy. On the morning they transported Pendo and Nia to the new enclosure, David carried Pendo in his arms one last time. She was bigger now, heavier, her muscles defined and strong. She no longer looked like the trembling, half-dead fawn he had pulled from the fire. She looked like a gazelle. He set her down gently inside the enclosure and stepped back. Pendo looked around, her ears twitching, taking in the vast new space. Nia bounded ahead, immediately exploring. Pendo glanced back at David once, her dark eyes meeting his. "You're going to be okay," David said, his voice thick. "You're going to run, and you're going to be free, and you're going to be exactly what you were always meant to be." Pendo blinked once, then turned and followed Nia into the tall grass. David stood at the fence long after they disappeared from view, his hands gripping the wire, his heart pounding with hope and fear in equal measure. This was the moment everything had been leading to. The plan was in motion, the choice was made. Now all he could do was wait and see if it was enough. The first 2 months in the semi-wild enclosure passed with cautious optimism. Pendo and Nia adapted to their new environment better than anyone had hoped. They established routines, grazing in the early morning when the grass was still damp with dew, resting in the shade during the scorching midday heat, exploring the perimeter in the evening when the air cooled. The cameras captured everything, and David watched the footage obsessively, analyzing every movement, every interaction, looking for signs of progress or regression. Pendo was changing. Her movements had become more fluid, more confident. She had learned to identify edible plants, to recognize the alarm calls of other species, to freeze when shadows passed overhead. The wild herd of Thompson's gazelles would sometimes gather near the fence, and Pendo would stand on her side, watching them with intense focus. She was learning their language, their rhythms, their way of being. But she hadn't forgotten David. Whenever he came to check on her, she would trot to the fence, press her muzzle through the wire, and allow him to stroke her ears. Those moments were bittersweet, proof that the bond between them hadn't broken, but also a reminder of the dependency they were trying to sever. "She's doing well," Amara said during one of her visits. "Better than I expected, honestly. Look at her body condition, her alertness, her social behavior with Nia. She's becoming what she needs to be." David nodded, but he couldn't shake the knot of anxiety in his chest. "When do we open the barriers?" "Another month, maybe 2, Amara said. "We need to be sure she can recognize and respond to predator threats. That's the final test. Everything else is secondary." The predator training began the following week. They used recorded sounds of lions and hyenas, played them at random intervals to teach Pendo and Nia to associate certain vocalizations with danger. They introduced scent markers from predators around the enclosure's perimeter. They even used drones equipped with raptor silhouettes to simulate aerial threats, watching to see if the young animals would react appropriately. Pendo's responses were mixed. Sometimes she would freeze and scan the area, her body tense and alert, exactly the right behavior. Other times she would look to David, as if seeking confirmation that the danger was real. That hesitation worried him. In the wild, hesitation meant death. Then, on a Tuesday morning in early October, everything changed. David was in his office when the radio crackled to life. It was Samuel, one of the rangers monitoring the northern section. "David, you need to get to the enclosure, now." The urgency in Samuel's voice sent ice through David's veins. He grabbed his medical kit and ran to his truck, his mind racing through possibilities. Injury, snakebite, heat stroke. He drove faster than he should have, the dirt road blurring beneath his tires, his hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. When he arrived at the enclosure, Samuel was standing at the fence with binoculars, his face grim. He pointed toward the far end, near the rocky outcropping. "Leopard," Samuel said, "got inside through a gap in the rocks we didn't know about. It's been stalking them for the last 20 minutes. David's blood turned to ice. He grabbed the binoculars and scanned the enclosure. It took him a moment to spot it. A young male leopard, maybe 3 years old, crouched in the tall grass about 50 meters from where Nia and Pendo were grazing. The leopard's body was low, his muscles coiled, his eyes locked on the 2 young ungulates. "Where's Nia?" David asked, his voice tight. "There, to the left." David found her. Nia had spotted the leopard. She was standing perfectly still, her ears forward, her body rigid with tension. She knew. She understood the danger. But Pendo was still grazing, oblivious, her head down, completely unaware that death was stalking her. "We need to scare it off," David said, already moving toward the gate. "Fire a shot. Make noise." "David, wait!" Samuel grabbed his arm. "Look!" David looked. Nia was moving. Slowly, deliberately, she stepped toward Pendo. She didn't run. She didn't flee. Instead, she positioned herself between Pendo and the leopard, and then she made a sound, a sharp, piercing alarm call that cut through the air like a blade. Pendo's head snapped up. She saw Nia's posture, heard the alarm, and her entire body changed. Her muscles tensed, her eyes went wide. She looked toward the tall grass and saw what Nia had seen. The leopard. For a heartbeat, everything was still. Predator and prey, locked in the eternal dance of survival. Then the leopard charged. He exploded from the grass like a golden missile, covering the distance in seconds. Nia bolted immediately, her legs churning, her body low and fast, but Pendo hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, and that hesitation was everything. The leopard closed the gap. 10 meters. 5. David's hand was on the gate, his body moving on pure instinct. He was shouting, his voice raw and desperate, but the sound was lost in the chaos. Samuel was beside him, raising his rifle, but he couldn't get a clear shot without risking hitting Pendo. Then Pendo ran. She ran like David had never seen her run before, her legs a blur, her body stretched and streamlined, pure speed and desperation. The leopard was faster, stronger, born for this. He was closing the distance, his claws extended, his jaws open. 3 meters. 2. David screamed her name. Pendo veered sharply to the left, cutting toward the rocky outcropping. The leopard followed, his momentum carrying him wide for just a moment. Pendo used that moment. She leapt, a wild, instinctive jump that carried her over a fallen log and into a narrow gap between 2 boulders. The leopard tried to follow, but he was too big, too heavy. He skidded to a stop, snarling with frustration. Pendo was trapped, wedged in the rocks, panting, her eyes wild with terror. The leopard circled the outcropping, looking for another way in. He was patient, methodical. He had time. David didn't think. He threw open the gate and ran. "David, no!" Samuel shouted, but David was already halfway across the enclosure, his medical kit forgotten, his only thought to reach Pendo before the leopard did. The leopard saw him coming. For a moment the big cat froze, weighing his options, prey within reach, or this strange, shouting human charging toward him. David grabbed a rock and hurled it at the leopard, hitting him in the shoulder. The leopard snarled, backing away a step. David grabbed another rock, another, screaming at the top of his lungs, making himself as large and threatening as possible. The leopard's ears flattened. He hissed once, a sound of frustration and anger, and then he turned and disappeared into the tall grass, slipping through the gap in the rocks and vanishing into the wild beyond. David stood there, panting, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst. Then he turned and ran to the outcropping. Pendo was still wedged in the rocks, trembling violently. He knelt down and reached for her. "It's okay," he whispered. "It's okay. I've got you." He carefully pulled her free, checking her for injuries. Miraculously, she was unharmed. No bites, no scratches, just terror and exhaustion. David gathered her into his arms, feeling her rapid heartbeat against his chest, and carried her to safety. They sealed the gap in the rocks that same afternoon. Samuel and his team worked through the day, reinforcing every potential weak point in the enclosure. Amara arrived the next morning, her expression grave. "This changes things," she said, examining Pendo. "She survived, but barely, and only because you intervened. If you hadn't been here—" "I know," David said quietly. They stood in silence, watching Pendo rest beside Nia. The 2 animals were pressed close together, seeking comfort in each other's presence. Nia kept grooming Pendo's neck, a soothing gesture that seemed to calm them both. "She hesitated," David said. "When the leopard charged, she hesitated. She didn't trust her instincts. She looked for me. Amara sighed. I saw the footage. You're right. That hesitation could have killed her. So what now? David asked, though he already knew the answer. We have two options, Amara said. We can keep working with her, extend the timeline, hope that she develops the right reflexes, or we accept that she's not going to make it in the wild. Amara placed a hand on his shoulder. David, she's come so far. You've done everything right. But some animals, they cross a line. They bond too deeply with humans, and they can't come all the way back. It doesn't mean you failed. It means she's different, special. The same thing that saved her life in that fire, her willingness to trust a human, might be the thing that keeps her from surviving out there. David looked at Pendo, curled up safely beside Nia, her eyes half closed. He thought about the burning field, about her standing there alone, crying out to him. He thought about every sleepless night, every moment of separation training, every small victory and crushing setback. He had fought so hard to give her freedom. But what if freedom wasn't what she needed? What if what she needed was him? There's a sanctuary, Amara said gently, in the Western Reserve. They specialize in animals who can't be released, not because they're injured, but because they're bonded, imprinted. Pendo would have space there, companionship, safety. It's not the wild, David, but it's not a cage either. It's somewhere in between, a life. David closed his eyes. A life. Not the life he had imagined for her, not the one he had fought for, but maybe it was the life she was meant to have. The one that honored both who she had been and who she had become because of him. I need time to think, David said. Of course, Amara replied. But David, don't take too long. We can't keep her here indefinitely, and we can't risk another encounter like this. She left him alone with his thoughts. With Pendo sleeping peacefully 20 meters away, with the impossible weight of a choice that felt like choosing between two different kinds of heartbreak. David sat down on the ground, his back against the fence, and watched the sun sink toward the horizon. He didn't know what the right answer was. He didn't know if there even was a right answer. All he knew was that Pendo had trusted him once, in the fire. And now, she was trusting him again, to decide what kind of life she would have. He couldn't let her down. Not this time. Not ever. David didn't sleep that night. He lay in his small room at the clinic, staring at the ceiling, replaying the leopard attack over and over in his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Pendo's hesitation, that fatal moment when she looked for him instead of trusting her instincts. He saw the leopard's claws extended, inches from her body. He saw what would have happened if he hadn't been there. And he knew with crushing certainty that he couldn't always be there. By dawn, he had made his decision. But saying it out loud felt like tearing something vital from his chest. He called Amara first. Then he drove to the enclosure and sat outside the fence, watching Pendo and Nia graze in the soft morning light. They moved together, synchronized and peaceful, as if yesterday's terror had never happened. But David could see the difference. Pendo stayed closer to Nia now, her body angled slightly toward her companion, seeking reassurance. And every few minutes she would lift her head and scan the area, her ears swiveling, searching for threats. She was learning, but not fast enough. Not completely enough. Samuel joined him after a while, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to David and sat down beside him on the dusty ground. "Rough night?" Samuel asked. "Yeah." They sat in silence for a while, watching the gazelles. Samuel had worked at the reserve for 15 years. He had seen countless animals come and go, some saved, some lost, some caught in that painful middle ground where survival and suffering blurred together. "You know what you have to do," Samuel said quietly. David nodded. "Doesn't make it any easier." "No," Samuel agreed. "It never does." He took a sip of his coffee. "But David, you gave her something no one else could have. You gave her a chance. And whatever happens next, sanctuary, captivity, whatever, she's alive because of you." That matters. Does it? David asked, his voice raw. If she can't be free, if she can't be what she was meant to be, what did I actually save? Just a body, just a heartbeat. Samuel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My daughter was born premature, 3 months early. The doctors said she might not make it. And if she did, she might have problems, development issues, learning disabilities. We spent 2 months in the hospital watching her fight for every breath. And I remember thinking the same thing you're thinking now. What kind of life would this be for her? What if we were just prolonging suffering?" David looked at him. "What happened?" "She lived," Samuel said, a small smile crossing his face. "She's 12 now. She does have challenges. She's on the autism spectrum, needs extra support at school. Her life isn't what we imagined it would be. But David, she's happy. She laughs, she draws, she loves animals just like her old man. Her life is different, but it's hers. And it's beautiful." He turned to look at David directly. "What I'm saying is, life doesn't have to look a certain way to be worth living. Pendo isn't going to run free across the Serengeti, but that doesn't mean her life will be meaningless. She'll have space, companionship, safety. She'll feel the sun on her back and the grass under her feet. She'll know that she was loved. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's more than enough." David felt something break loose in his chest, a knot of grief and guilt he'd been carrying for months. His eyes burned with tears he'd been holding back since the fire. "I wanted more for her," he whispered. "I know," Samuel said gently, "but sometimes wanting more for someone means accepting what they can actually have and loving them through it." Amara arrived that afternoon with paperwork for the sanctuary transfer. The place was called Kivuli Ridge, Shadow Ridge in Swahili, and it was located about 200 kilometers west in the foothills of the Pare Mountains. It was a permanent home for wildlife who couldn't survive in the wild, animals with disabilities, chronic injuries, or, like Pendo, deep psychological bonds with humans that made release impossible. "It's a good place," Amara assured him, spreading photographs across the table. 20 hectares of protected land, natural habitat, resident herds of gazelles and impalas. Pendo and Nia can stay together. They'll have room to run, places to explore, but with veterinary care and protection from predators. They're not in cages, David. They have lives. David studied the photographs, rolling grasslands, acacia trees, a small watering hole reflecting the sky. It looked peaceful, safe, nothing like the endless plains where wild gazelles ran free, but nothing like a zoo either. Somewhere in between, a compromise. "When would she go?" he asked. "Whenever you're ready," Amara said. "But I'd recommend soon. The longer she stays here in this liminal space, the harder it will be for both of you." David nodded. He knew she was right. Dragging it out would only deepen the pain. "1 week," he said. "I need 1 more week with her." Amara placed her hand over his. 1 week. David spent that week at the enclosure. He brought a camping chair and sat outside the fence from dawn until dusk, watching Pendo live. He documented everything: how she grazed, how she rested, how she played with Nia in the cooling evening air. He wanted to memorize every detail, to carry it with him when she was gone. Pendo seemed to sense something had changed. She spent more time near the fence where David sat, grazing close enough that he could hear the soft sounds of her chewing, the rhythm of her breathing. Sometimes she would come right up to the wire and let him touch her muzzle, her eyes calm and trusting. On the 4th day, David brought his journal and began writing. He wrote about the fire, about finding her in that burning field, about the way she had looked at him with complete faith. He wrote about the sleepless nights, the separation training, the moment when she first ran to Nia instead of him. He wrote about the leopard attack, about his decision, about the grief that felt like drowning. And as he wrote, something shifted inside him. The guilt began to loosen its grip, because he realized that Amara and Samuel were right. He hadn't failed Pendo. He had given her every possible chance. He had fought for her freedom with everything he had. And when that freedom proved impossible, he had made the hardest choice, to let her live a different kind of life, a smaller life perhaps, but a life nonetheless. That wasn't failure, that was love. On the 6th day, a young ranger named Kione came to the enclosure during her break. She had heard about Pendo, about the story of the Gazelle who begged for help in the fire. "Is it true," she asked David, "that she came to you, that she chose you?" David nodded. "It's true." Kione was quiet for a moment, watching Pendo graze. Then she said, "My grandmother used to tell me that animals can see into a person's heart. She said they know who will help them and who won't. Maybe that's what happened. Maybe Pendo saw something in you that told her you would fight for her." David felt his throat tighten. "I tried. I really tried." "You did more than try," Kione said firmly. "You succeeded. Look at her. She's alive. She's healthy. She's happy. That's not failure, Dr. Karoma. That's a miracle." After Kione left, David sat with those words. A miracle. Not the miracle he had imagined, not the wild, free life running with a herd across the open plains, but a miracle nonetheless. Pendo had been dying in that fire, alone, starving, terrified, and now she was grazing peacefully in the afternoon sun, companionship beside her, safety around her. He had given her that. He had given her life. On the 7th day, David entered the enclosure for the last time. Pendo and Nia trotted over to greet him. He knelt down and let Pendo press her muzzle into his hands. Her eyes were bright, curious, content. She didn't know what was coming. She didn't know that tomorrow she would be loaded into a transport vehicle and driven to a new home, a new life. She only knew this moment, the warmth of the sun, the presence of her friend, the gentle touch of the human who had saved her. David stroked her ears, memorizing the texture of her fur, the warmth of her body. He thought about everything they had been through together, every impossible obstacle they had faced, and he realized that this goodbye was just another one, another challenge to survive. "You're going to be okay," he whispered to her. "You're going to have a good life, and you're going to remember that you were loved, that you were worth fighting for." Pendo blinked slowly, her breath warm against his hands. David stood up, his vision blurred with tears, and walked toward the gate. This time, when Pendo bleated after him, he didn't stop. He kept walking, each step feeling like it might break him, but he didn't turn back, because loving Pendo meant letting her go, and he loved her enough to survive the breaking. That night, David sat in his office and sealed the journal he had been writing. On the first page, he wrote a dedication. "For Pendo, the bravest gazelle I ever knew. You taught me that saving someone isn't always about giving them the life we imagine for them. Sometimes it's about giving them the life they can actually live, and loving them through every moment of it. You will always be wild in my heart." He closed the journal and placed it in his desk drawer. Tomorrow, Pendo would begin her journey to Kivuli Ridge, and David would begin his journey of learning to live without her. But tonight, for just a few more hours, they were still connected. A man and a gazelle, bound together by a moment of impossible trust in a burning field. And that bond, David knew, would never truly break. No matter how far apart they were, no matter what came next. The morning Pendo left was clear and bright, the kind of day that felt too beautiful for goodbyes. The transport vehicle arrived at dawn, a specially designed trailer with padded walls and ventilation, built for comfort and safety. David had sedated both Pendo and Nia lightly, just enough to keep them calm during the loading process. He carried Pendo himself, one last time, feeling the familiar weight of her body in his arms, breathing in the scent of grass and earth that clung to her fur. He placed her gently beside Nia in the padded compartment. Pendo's eyes were half closed, drowsy but aware. David stroked her ears one final time. "Be brave," he whispered, "just like you were in the fire." Then he stepped back and watched as the doors closed between them. The vehicle pulled away slowly, disappearing down the dirt road in a cloud of dust. David stood there long after it vanished from sight, his hands empty, his chest hollow. Samuel stood beside him, silent and steady, a quiet presence in the unbearable stillness. "You did the right thing," Samuel said eventually. David nodded, unable to speak. 3 weeks later, David received an email from Dr. Mtui, the lead veterinarian at Kivuli Ridge. Attached were photographs and a short video. David's hands trembled as he opened the files. The first photograph showed Pendo standing in a field of golden grass, the Pare Mountains rising blue and distant behind her. She looked healthy, strong, her coat gleaming in the sunlight. The second showed her grazing beside Nia, their bodies close, companionable. The third, the one that made David's breath catch, showed Pendo running, not fleeing, not panicked, just running, her legs extended in full stride, pure motion and grace. He clicked on the video. It was short, maybe 30 seconds. Pendo was playing, leaping over a fallen log, circling back to Nia, tossing her head. There was joy in her movements, lightness, life. Dr. Mantui's message was simple. She's thriving. She and Nia have integrated beautifully with the resident herd. Pendo is cautious but curious, and she's learning from the older gazelles. She eats well, sleeps peacefully, and seems content. You gave her an extraordinary gift, Dr. Karoma. Thank you for trusting us with her. David read the message 3 times. Then he closed his laptop, walked outside, and let himself cry. Deep, shaking sobs that had been building for months. He cried for Pendo, for the wildlife she would never have. He cried for himself, for the bond he had to sever. He cried for every impossible choice, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt and fear. And when the tears finally stopped, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. 6 months later, David made the drive to Kivuli Ridge. It was a pilgrimage he had been putting off, unsure if he was ready to see her again. But Amara had encouraged him. "Closure isn't about forgetting," she had said. "It's about witnessing, about seeing that what you did mattered." The sanctuary was more beautiful than the photographs had shown. Rolling hills covered in tall grass, clusters of acacia and fig trees providing shade, a network of streams and watering holes reflecting the wide African sky. David parked near the main building and was greeted by Dr. Mtui, a warm, silver-haired woman with kind eyes. "She's in the eastern paddock," Dr. Mtui said, "with the main herd. Would you like to see her?" David's heart was pounding. Yes. They walked along a winding path, past enclosures where other animals lived, a 3-legged wildebeest, a blind zebra, an elderly giraffe who watched them pass with ancient, knowing eyes. Finally, they reached a viewing platform overlooking a vast meadow. "There," Dr. Mtui said, pointing. It took David a moment to find her. There were at least 20 gazelles scattered across the field, and Pendo had grown. She was nearly full-sized now, indistinguishable from the others at first glance. But then she moved, and David recognized her gait, the particular way she held her head. She was grazing near the center of the herd, flanked by Nia on one side and an older female on the other. As David watched, a young male approached her playfully. Pendo danced away, circled back, and the two of them bounded across the grass together, their movements fluid and joyful. "She has a mate," Dr. Mtui said with a smile. "Well, a companion. They're not breeding the gazelles here, but those two are inseparable. She chose him herself about 2 months ago." David felt something swell in his chest. Pride, relief, bitter-sweet joy. Pendo had a life, not the one he had imagined, but a real life nonetheless. She had friends, safety, space to run. She had found her place in the world. "Does she—" David's voice cracked. "Does she seem happy?" Dr. Mtui looked at him with gentle understanding. "I can't speak for a gazelle's emotions, Dr. Karoma, but I can tell you that she eats well, plays often, and chooses to be with the herd rather than alone. She's bonded, engaged, alive. If that's not happiness, it's as close as we can hope for. David nodded, unable to look away from Pendo. Part of him wanted to call out to her, to see if she would remember him, but he didn't. This wasn't about him anymore. This was about her, about witnessing the life she was living and honoring it for what it was. They stood there for a long time, watching the herd graze and play in the golden afternoon light. And slowly, David felt the last piece of grief loosen its grip. He had saved her. Not perfectly, not the way he had dreamed, but he had saved her. And that was enough. As David drove away from Kivuli Ridge that evening, the sun setting behind the mountains in shades of amber and rose, he thought about the question Amara had asked him months ago in the burning aftermath of that terrible day. Why me? Why did you come to me? He had wondered if Pendo had made a mistake, if she had trusted the wrong creature, chosen the wrong savior. But now, watching the road unspool before him, he understood. Pendo hadn't made a mistake. She had made a choice. In her moment of greatest need, she had reached across the vast divide between species and said, "Help me." And he had answered. That was the miracle. Not the perfection of the outcome, but the courage of the connection. A tiny gazelle and a human stranger, brought together by fire and fear and an impossible leap of faith. They had both been changed by it. They had both survived it. And in the end, wasn't that what love was? Not the grand gestures or the perfect endings, but the willingness to show up, to fight, to hold on and let go in equal measure, to honor someone else's life as sacred, even when it didn't look the way you imagined it would. David thought about all the animals he had treated over the years, all the lives he had touched and lost and saved. He thought about the ones who hadn't made it, the ones who had slipped away despite his best efforts. And he thought about Pendo running free in a sanctuary meadow, alive and whole and loved. He had given her a chance, and she had taken it and made it into something beautiful. That was enough. That would always be enough. Years later, when people asked David Koroma about the gazelle who begged for help in the burning field, he would tell them the truth. He would say that he didn't save Pendo alone, that Amara and Samuel and Dr. Mimtwi and countless others had been part of her journey. He would say that Pendo had saved herself too, by being brave enough to trust, strong enough to adapt, resilient enough to build a new life from the ashes of the old one. And he would say that every time he closed his eyes, he could still see her, standing in that clearing, surrounded by flames, her eyes locked on his, choosing hope over fear, choosing life over surrender, choosing him. And he had chosen her right back. That moment had changed everything. It had broken him open and put him back together differently. It had taught him that love wasn't about control or perfection. It was about presence, about showing up in someone's darkest hour and saying, "I see you, I'm here, you matter." Pendo had given him that gift, and he had spent the rest of his life trying to give it back to every animal, every person, every lost and frightened soul who crossed his path. Because that's what miracles did. They didn't just save one life. They rippled outward, touching everything, changing everyone, creating new possibilities where none had existed before. And somewhere in the foothills of the Pare Mountains, in a sanctuary called Kivuli Ridge, a gazelle ran through the golden grass, her legs strong, her heart whole, her life a testament to the impossible power of compassion. She had been saved by a stranger in a burning field, and she had saved him right back. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and if you've ever witnessed or lived something like this.